Welcome to Intro Psychology. I'm Lauren.
I'm Susan.
And I'm Greg.
We're your instructors for this course. We're going to take you on your journey through psychology. We'll go over different areas of psychology and how different psychologists examine and explain thought and behavior.
We are all very different. We like different things, we think differently, we even react differently.
So for instance, I have something here that might create different reactions in people.
Ooh,
My pet snake Tickles. I've come to really enjoy him. He's a nice snake.
I wouldn't mind holding Tickles or touching him, but I certainly wouldn't want him as a pet. Lauren?
No, I don't do snakes.
You don't do snakes?
No, I don't do snakes.
A perfect example of how people react differently to different situations.
So there's many different areas of psychology. For instance, personality psychologists would look at what's going on here and try to really understand the individual differences and the fear and why I'm not really afraid, you're fine, and she's more or less terrified.
Behavioral psychologists might look at an individual's learning history. So, for example, I was exposed to a lot of snakes when I was growing up, so perhaps I've learned that snakes aren't dangerous for me. And a social psychologist may look at how other people's behavior influences our own. So, for example, looking at other people's reactions may influence our own reactions. A biological psychologist perhaps may look at Lauren's fright response in terms of increase in heart rate or even sweating. And a neuroscientist, they may look at the areas of the brain that are activated during the fear response, such as the amygdala. But for now, I think it's time for Tickles to head home.
Even though this example exploited my fear of snakes, thanks a lot, Greg, it was a really effective tool for Susan and Greg to use to show you just how diverse psychology can be. Now, psychology is defined as a study of thought and behavior, and it's an amazing way to make sense of our world.
Other than phobias, what are two areas of human behavior that you're curious about? This could be something like completing the sentence, why do people blank? There's no right or wrong answer here. Psychology can tap into your interests in many different ways.
Have you ever wondered why people lie? Or why do some people love sex and others not so much? Why do some people kill people, but others will risk their life to save the life of a stranger? Why are some people outgoing, and why are some people shy? Why is it that you salivate at the smell of your favorite food? And really, why is it that we can remember random childhood life events, but we can't remember what we had for breakfast this morning? Well, these are just a few of the questions that psychologists have asked and provided answers to over the years. Psychology is so much more than a therapist sitting on a couch talking to a person. It's the real science behind understanding people and their thoughts and behaviors.
It's important to know that the field has two main areas. There's the practice side and the research side. The practice side focuses on applying the knowledge we gain from research in everyday life. For example, diagnosing and treating thought and behavior problems, or helping businesses operate more effectively, or even to get your children to behave properly. The research side focuses on furthering our knowledge and understanding of how people behave and think. So let me ask you this. What do you think being a psychologist allows you to do? Go ahead and check all that apply. Each of these options is a possibility, because what a psychologist does depends on the type of psychologist he or she is. In fact, there are over 25 different subfields of psychology. So now that you know that there are many types of psychology, which options would you consider not to be a real subfield of psychology? Choose two. Don't worry if you don't know. We'll talk about them after. Canine psychology and automobile traffic psychology are not real subfields of psychology. Even though some of us might think we need a traffic psychologist when we're stuck in traffic for hours and going crazy, it's not a real subfield. Neither is canine psychology, although there are psychologists who primarily use animals in their research. And behavioral psychology has been used to teach animals how to do amazing things. For example, did you know that rats can detect landmines through smell? Or that dolphins can locate underwater mines and protect boats? Psychologists can learn a lot from animals through research, and psychological methods can be used to teach animals how to help and work with humans. One type of psychology is industrial and organizational psychology, or IO psychology for short. IO psychology is an applied science that involves understanding real world rather than laboratory behavior. Given the name industrial and organizational psychology, in what area do you think IO psychology is applied? Meaning, what part of your life do you think would IO psychology be applied to? Type your answer here. Don't worry if you don't know the correct answer, just guess. If you guessed anything that involved a work setting, so industrial plants or a business office, you were right, because industrial and organizational psychology is the application of psychological concepts and questions to the work setting. Industrial and organizational psychology focuses on two distinct sets of problems. The industrial side involves matching employees to their job and using psychological principles to select employees and evaluate job performance. The industrial side of IO psychology is sometimes referred to as personnel psychology. The organizational side focuses on making workers more productive. In addition, they examine how management styles and environment influence motivation, satisfaction, and productivity. IO psychology is one of the fastest growing subdisciplines in psychology. I also wanted to talk about health psychology. Health psychology examines the role psychological factors play in our health. For example, they'll ask questions like this. Does stress, a psychological factor, affect our health? What do you think? Yes or no? The answer is yes, it does. But we're going to get into this later in our lesson on stress and health. In this course, we will focus on major areas of psychology, such as cognitive, behavioral, developmental, neurological, and biological, personality, social, clinical, and forensic psychology. The take-home message here is that psychology is an incredibly diverse field of study.
You might ask, what's the point of all these types of psychology? Well, each subfield has a different goal and a different method used to achieve these goals. It's like looking at the world through different lenses.
Different psychologists will focus on different types of questions. For example, a famous case in New York City from the 1960s reported that a woman was brutally attacked and ultimately murdered over a 30-minute period of time in an apartment complex. More than 30 people saw or heard this attack, yet only one person called the police. What type of psychologist do you think would explore why almost no one reacted to this crime while it was taking place? Select one. This type of question would be for a social psychologist, because they focus on understanding how other people influence how we think, feel, or behave, or in this case, how we didn't behave. The fact is, essentially any type of psychologist could examine this case. However, the specific question of why no one reacted when a lot of people saw and heard it would be examined by a social psychologist. Cognitive psychologists usually look at how people perceive things, remember things, how they solve problems, and things like that. And a developmental psychologist will look at how thought and behavior changes or remains the same across the lifespan. So it might be confusing because a clinical psychologist deals with diagnosing mental illness, and in this situation may help to determine if the attacker was mentally stable. But again, this question was focusing on why no one helped. That could also be the case for a forensic psychologist. A forensic psychologist might want to examine the person who committed the crime, or the crime itself. Now the key here is that even though this question was directed towards a social psychologist, a clinical or even a forensic psychologist could also examine this case. But I'm going to send you to Greg to talk a little bit more about forensic psychology.
So what kind of questions would a forensic psychologist ask? So many of you may be familiar with TV shows like Lie to Me or the movie and book Silence of the Lambs. These shows depict psychologists who solve crimes using their knowledge of psychology to narrow in on the criminal cases and solve the case. These are examples of some sexier kinds of things forensic psychologists might ask and do. More often than not, however, they're involved in more mundane things like custody battle disputes, insurance claims, or evaluating witnesses in criminal court cases. So what type of question do cognitive psychologists ask? Can we really multitask? How does our attachment change over our lives? Why does my dog learn to salivate when I open the door to the cabinet? What does an increase in dopamine in my brain do to my mood? Or was the shooter having a psychotic episode and is he competent to stand trial? Choose which one you think psychologists would ask, and more than one can be correct. One of the questions that a cognitive psychologist would ask is, can we really multitask? Because that has to do with focus and attention, and that's a cognitive or mental activity. Another question that a cognitive psychologist might ask among these is about the dog learning to salivate when the door opens. because what's going on here is the dog is learning to associate the door opening with the food, and that's a learning process, and that's also the domain for cognitive psychologists. What's not the domain for a cognitive psychologist is how attachment changes over our lives. That's more the question for a developmental psychologist because it has to do with change over time. Another question that would not be one for cognitive psychology would be mood and dopamine. That's the brain and how neurotransmitters affect our behavior. That would be the question for behavioral neuroscience. The shooter and whether he's having a psychotic episode and how competent he is to stand trial is more for a forensic psychologist because that has to do with his mental state and the legal question of competence.
Say you wanted to determine if introverts or shy people learn better in quiet environments and extroverts or outgoing people learn better in noisy environments. Which area of psychology would you choose to consult? Clinical, cognitive, behavioral, personality, or developmental?
Well, Susan, I would say personality psychologist because we're looking at introverts and extroverts. And I know that personality psychologists will look at the differences between different personality traits like those two. And I would guess cognitive psychologists too, because I know they're interested in how we learn and solve problems. Am I right?
That's right, Lauren. Good job. This gets us to an important point about psychology and the fact that we have many different subdisciplines. As you can see from this example, not one perspective of psychology tells the whole story. We may have to take information from different perspectives to get an accurate and complete description of the situation. Psychology helps us make sense of the world. By using different levels of analysis and different perspectives, we can get a better understanding of why behavior occurs, or in some cases, why it does not.
So now that we've come to a close in this first lesson, we hope you can see that psychology answers all of these questions and more, how deep, rich, and broad psychology is as a discipline. In fact, it's as much about lab coats, and children, courtrooms, learning and memory, our personalities, and how other people influence us as much as it is about couches and therapists. So in the coming lessons, we're going to focus in more detail on some of the kinds of questions that psychologists ask and then attempt to answer. And in doing so, we hope to stimulate you to ask your own questions about human nature. Who knows, maybe one day you'll be providing us with answers as a psychologist.
Congratulations, you just finished your first lesson. Following the lesson is going to be a problem set where you answer questions based on what you've learned so far. Now this is going to be the format for every lesson to come.
So if you're ready, go back to the problem set for lesson 1 and answer each question. If you get stuck, go back to the lesson or to the forum where you can then interact with your peers or with us.
After you finish a problem set for lesson 1, you're ready to move on to lesson 2, where we're going to look at how psychologists conduct experiments to learn more about human thought and behavior. Now, it's important for the remainder of the course that you take notes while you're watching the lessons. In addition, be sure to check the instructor's notes section, which is here, to get other valuable information that's contained in each lesson. And we'll see you in lesson 2.